welcome the chief storyteller from Lamon Luther to the TEDxAtlanta stage, Brian Preston.
Well, I do love to tell stories, and I'm not going to lie and say that I'm not nervous here, but how many times have we seen people in our communities like this? We probably even encountered that today. Yeah, or even this. And then there's signs like this. Why lie? I just want a beer. And so we kind of sympathize with those guys because at least he's being honest, right? The interesting thing about living in the United States is that 15% of people living here are living in poverty. And actually, according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, 636,000 people are homeless right now. And so I actually believe that number is greater because the amount of people living in uncounted suburbs. And so in 2006, my wife and I experienced poverty firsthand. We had built a pretty thriving residential development company, and it was going extremely well. And as most of you know, in the headlines, that tanked. And we were kind of a part of that. And so my wife and I, we lost everything. We lost our house, we lost our car, we lost everything. We drained our savings trying to keep a business afloat. And for the first time in my life, I kind of knew what poverty, I knew what it felt like. And so also during that time, I was introduced to a community of people living in the woods where I was living in safe suburb United States. And so when you think about homelessness, you don't think about homeless people living in the suburbs, right? You think about urban homelessness. You think about the very nomadic type situations where you see guys sleeping here one night, sleeping there the next night. And so when I heard about this group of people living in the woods in my community, I had to go in. I had to learn more. I had to figure out how we could help meet some of their needs. And so a friend and I, we literally just went in and we said, hey, we're going to, even though everybody's telling us not to go in, there were stories of people getting injured and actually dying from going in. We said, we're going to go in and see if we can help meet some needs. So I met a guy named Scott. And Scott had been living in the woods for 4 years. And he was kind of like the guy in charge. And that's something also that I found to be interesting in this setting is it was almost like they had created their own community, and all the resources that had come in kind of filtered through Scott. And he would give what he called tours. And so a friend and I walked in, and he said, hey, I'm going to give you guys a tour today and show you around. So he would take us from one camp to the other. This is actually Barry's camp. Barry was smart enough to figure out that if you dig a hole in the ground, that it's actually warm down there. So he hand dug a basement out in the woods and set his camp up in a treehouse. And so this picture right here actually shows tarps wrapped around his camp. And so Scott would take us from camp to camp, and we would try to understand and learn how we could meet some of the needs. And we quickly realized that like firewood was on top of the list, and propane, and batteries. And so I went home and I was excited knowing the experience that my wife and I had just went through. And I tried to figure out how we could help. And so we rallied up some people in our community. We started kind of putting together our resources. And so we started meeting those needs. We started bringing firewood in. We started bringing propane in. Some of them had little gas grills. We started bringing candles in. They would actually light candles in their tents to stay warm at night, which is extremely, extremely dangerous. But that was the way they stayed warm. And so this happened. This went on for about 2 years of us bringing and meeting these needs to these people living in this community. And we felt so good about what we were doing on the inside. But we didn't see really any change in the guys after 2 years of meeting these needs. So I was frustrated. I was extremely frustrated, not necessarily at the guys, but at myself, because I felt like I could be doing more. I felt like that I was actually enabling them to live like this because I was bringing them more stuff. I was kind of hurting their situation. And so one day I was frustrated. It was a cold winter day, and I was having a conversation with my friend Mitch. Mitch and I were actually talking about which old classic rock band was better, Boston or Journey. He was a huge classic rock fan, and I worked up enough nerve where I was like, Mitch, what do you really need? How can we really help you? I feel like the stuff that we're bringing in is just actually hurting you. And he set his beer down and kind of looked up at me with his whiskey-stained eyes and said, Brian, what we really need a job. We really need an opportunity to provide for ourselves, because you know what? We don't have driver's license. We don't even have a car. We don't have a cell phone. Nobody on this planet would hire us in this kind of condition. And I was really shocked by his response, because I was thinking, wow, this guy wants a job. What would it look like if we were to actually put some of these guys to work? So at the time, I was working extremely safe, 9-to-5 job as a creative director with the salary and with the insurance, and life was safe, and life was good, and had 2 young children, and I just was wrestling with these guys that were, some of them even dying out in the woods while I went to home every night in my safe house. And I was trying to figure out ways that we could help them. And my wife actually found a new addiction in this. Any Pinterest fans in the house? Amen. All right, so for those of you who don't know, Pinterest is crack cocaine for women. Once they get a little hit of it, it's over from there. And so my wife, she would find these tables and these bookshelves and these buffets, and she would say, hey, this looks really simple, and it's made out of pallet wood, and I think you could probably build it. And I'm certainly no master carpenter. I've done carpentry all my life. And so I borrowed a few tools from my dad, and we started doing the Saturday garage thing, the Saturday Pinterest project day, we called it. And so we started building tables in my garage, and then friends would come over and they would see some of the stuff that we built, and they would say, hey, where did you get that? And I was thinking, oh gosh, they're going to see that it's like out of level and that it's just not finished right. And they would say, no, we want to buy it. Where did you get it? And so we started putting them on Craigslist, and we started selling them like crazy. I think we were selling them way too cheap because we couldn't even keep enough in stock. And so one thing evolved to another, and it hit me one night. I was thinking about what Mitch told me that day. And knowing that the way that these guys were builders and that they were constructors, most of them were actually in the housing market, carpenters and stuff, just kind of hit me out of the blue one night. I said, what would it look like if we actually put some of these guys to work building furniture? And so we did that. In January of this year, I met a guy named TC. And I said, TC had a little disconnected cell phone that took pictures, and he had a picture of a deck that he had recently replaced. And he was so proud of this deck that he built. He would show everybody. And so I knew that he had basic carpentry skills. I knew that he was a builder, that he was a constructor. And so TC was actually the first guy we employed. And I told him, I was like, TC, I'm going to pick you up on January 2nd. I'm going to pick you up. And it was so cool. He was out there, just literally, I picked him up from the woods in his jacket, and he was so excited to work. And I couldn't believe that he was actually going to show up. And so that very first day, we did nothing that had to do with furniture, but we actually worked in a lady's basement. And that first project, we made enough money to kind of shift our focus from building to working in a basement to actually building furniture. And it quickly evolved through social media. We would post our pictures on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook. Before we know it, we had orders from these large design firms in just a matter of 1 month. And I don't know, I think they were really intrigued by the story more than what the products we were created. And so the first time in 15 years for TC, who had been homeless for that long, he had a consistent job, consistent way of providing for himself. And so I left TC at the shop one day. I had to go run a few errands. And usually the way we built is I would kind of do most of the work, and he would kind of assemble it. And one day I left the shop, and I was like, TC, I need you to just finish this table. The frame was already built. And so I left and ran some errands, and I came back and saw this. TC, who our perception of what a bum would be, built this on his own. And all he needed was the tools. All he needed was a chance. And so it was that moment that I knew that this actually might work. And so TC had pretty much given up on life. He had, as I said earlier, he'd been homeless for 15 years. He would go up here to Georgia and go back down to Florida looking for work. And so for 15 years, he had been homeless. And then once TC had the opportunity, I saw a spark in him. He came alive. And then it was then that I knew that we were building more than furniture. We were building something greater. I believe that at the inner core of all of us, we all need one thing. Every person in here, every person watching this needs one thing. And if you look into TC's eyes right here, you can see what it is. It's hope. We all need it. We may not think we need it right now, but there's been times in our life where we felt like, I needed some hope here. And so what I've learned through running and starting this company is that this one word connects all of us. It connects every human being on the planet. We all need this. We all long for it. We all want it. And so we decided to build a company around creating hope and opportunity for the craftsman. And I love what Matt and Carrie were saying earlier about keeping this art alive. You see, both of my grandmothers were both working in seamstress plants. And I remember as a kid that the entire community, the entire southern community, was built around this textile plant. And they were crafters in their own regards. They would spend all day crafting and building and working with their hands. And so as more and more jobs went offshores, they lost their jobs. And actually the communities where they once worked have never been the same since that textile plant moved out. And this is what we see with TC and these other guys that we're hiring, there is a direct correlation. You see, these guys are created to build, to work with their hands, to craft. That's all they know. And so when they're not able to do those things, they get depressed and they get frustrated. So our company quickly grew, and we were able to hire 3 guys. This is Jeffrey, the third guy, the third carpenter that we were able to employ. And when I first hired Jeffrey, he hadn't worked in 4 years, and he was pretty rough around the edges, to say the least. I was actually scared to take him out in public with me, so I'm just worried what he might say or do. And I think Jeffrey would be the first one to tell you that, he's really, he hasn't been the best father to his children. And that Jeffrey, he has 2 little girls, Madison and Ella, and so he just wasn't in their life. And I think a lot of it had to do because he wasn't able to provide for them. And so he was an absentee father, and when he started working, I heard him talk about his kids more, which was very interesting and very intriguing that, wow, this guy he's rough, would actually begin to have an interest in his children. And so a few months ago, school was starting back, and he came to me one day. He's like, hey, Brian, my kids need new shoes. They need school supplies. They need a few other things. I've got a little bit of money from working here. Can you help me out with the rest? And so some friends and I, we kind of rallied together and blew this girl's socks off. They had like 2 new pairs of shoes and all these school supplies. And he delivered those to him on a Friday, and the Saturday, the next day, I got a call from Madison, the 9-year-old. And she said, Brian, thank you for all the cool stuff. She said, thanks for letting my daddy work. Because you know what? Daddy's not mad anymore. And for the first time in years, he comes to see us. And so I thought we were just putting a few homeless guys to work. I thought we were just creating some opportunity for guys just to build again. But I had no idea that we were actually giving 2 little girls their father back. And so that's what we've seen with Lamon Luther. And, it's so interesting, the direct correlation between the heightened poverty levels in the United States and the way we consume our products. The more and more we consume offshores, the less and less opportunity there is right here. And so, unfortunately, it forces little pockets of homeless people in suburbs, and then communities like where my grandmas were built and manufactured and did the seamstress thing, there's nothing for them to do. They're out of work. We see that in the furniture sector. We see that in the textile sector. And I get asked a lot, like, where does Lamon Luther, the name, come from? Because obviously my name is not Lamon Luther. It's actually named after my grandfather, Lamon Luther Wilson. And Lamon Luther Wilson was a builder. And I really feel like he represents a dying generation of carpenters and craftsmen. And if he wanted a barn, he would go build a barn. If he wanted a table, he didn't go to Rooms to Go or a local store like that. He would build the table. And so I feel like by naming this company after him, we're keeping this art alive, this art of crafting, handcrafted goods alive. And so the question is why? Why would we create a company around creating opportunity and hope for the craftsman? Well, we actually believe we can reestablish entire communities. We actually believe that if we put folks back to work, go into these communities where the textile plants have shut down, the furniture manufacturers have shut down, if we can go back into those, create jobs, we could actually save an entire community. What would that look like? And so it also matters because we're teaching a small group of men not to just only be consumers, but to actually be contributors to society. We've seen 2 of our guys that were living in the woods when we first hired them move out of the woods on their own to move into housing in just 2 months' time. And it wasn't me pushing them to do it. It wasn't Brian nagging them. It was them on their own wanting to make a change in their life. And so I guess I kind of came here today to tell you that you were created to build something beautiful. And you may not realize it. It may not be something literally with your hands, like something that you actually build. Maybe it's a nonprofit that ends sex trafficking. Maybe it's a social enterprise. Maybe it's actually building hope for somebody like TC and these guys. So I came here today to tell you to build something beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much.